So with that being said, I'm going to teach you a few things. Number one, what you should have in your knitting arsenal, how to read a yarn label, and then we'll get into the pattern and go from there. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to interrupt. Be happy to answer for you. So knitting really only requires very few tools. Number one, your knitting needle. You have a pair of straight needles. There's also a different kind called circular needles. And Anali, if you want to go ahead and spotlight the instruction screen, I can start showing there. When you work for straight needles are great for flat projects. If you like making blankets, home accessories, it's a wonderful tool to have, and it keeps it very handy. I also have what you call circular needles. Circular needles are for projects that are in the round. You will use them to make hats. You can make socks with them. You can also knit flat as well. You just don't join or connect them. These particular circular needles are kind of have an added feature. They're called interchangeable needles. And interchangeable needles means that the diameter or the length of the cord will always stay the same, but you can change your needle size out for a different size. This is handy when sometimes you're working hats or different brims that may have a larger or a smaller edging, and you can change the size very quickly without transferring all the stitches off to another needle. I prefer to work both flat projects and circular projects with a circular needle. And the reason why is when you knit with straight needles, depending on the length, you'll hold it in your arms and you're a little stronger as far as your wrists, that you're knitting a little tighter. With circular needles, you can go closer to your body. I learned this when I was knitting on an airplane. I was sticking my elbows out, and I found that that my seatmate wasn't too happy about that. So with circular needles, especially if you're in tight spaces, you can knit a little closer than you would with straight needles. Another benefit with a circular needle too, as you start knitting projects that require more stitches on your needle, for example, blankets, or if you're knitting with bulkier fabric and bulkier yarn, you'll find the concept of knitting is that all your stitches are on one needle and you transfer them to the next needle. That pretty soon one side gets really heavy the longer your project gets. When you use circular needles, your fabric gets distributed more in the center, so it provides less tension on one hand at one time. So if you have carpal tunnel issues, take a look at circular needles to ease some of that burden for your hands. So this is what I'm going to be working with, but what you'll be working with is the exact same thing. So don't worry about if mine look a little different. In addition to knitting with a needle, of course, you're also going to need some scissors. I like some just good old-fashioned sharp scissors, and of course these are protected. It's also great to have a ruler. And they also come in different ones. There's straight ones. Of course, you also have your sewing tape if you have that. Those are pretty true to the number size. There's also retractable rulers as well. One thing I learned early on when I was doing gauge for some yarn companies is that I always seemed to be missing gauge. It was coming out too short for the projects. And I was realizing that not all retractable rulers are the same. Some of them are made in different countries. And because of that, the metric sizing is off compared to the inching. So you can make sure that it is a true size by getting like a sewing tape where you know they have an accurate, and just measure to make sure the inch is actually where the inch is. As you can start to see, especially in the 4, see how the 4 is off, just off slightly, the 5 is off just a little more. And as you go along, see the 6 is not in the right spot. So that can really affect your gauge when you use some of these retractable, cheaper tape measures. So just be mindful of that. So straight rulers are a great benefit. And then also just the sewer's tape measure, that's going to find a more true to form. So just kind of a heads up, that's a wise lesson I learned later in life, that hopefully I can save you some of that grief, especially if you end up making projects that you're forming for yourself or for somebody. That you don't cry at the beginning. Another thing you need at the end of your project is you're going to need a darning needle. And usually you use a blunt tip, so you're not going to stab your project or yourself. They come in different sizes. There's some small ones. This is kind of more of a larger one. There are also ones that have that are plastic. There's ones that have little hooks at the ends to help you kind of pick your stitches. Any of them do the same job, but they're great for weaving in ends. Another fun thing you can have is our stitch markers. And stitch markers are very handy because when you start getting to larger projects or more complicated projects, you may have to keep track of certain stitches so you're not off your count. And they come in different kinds. One are closed stitch markers. As you can see, there's no way that I could take this off. So if you accidentally knit with it and it knits into your fabric, you're going to have to sacrifice your stitch marker. You can also have opening ones. These are very common to have. I always suggest trying to get the thinnest ones with the stitch markers, only because if you have thick or bulky rings, sometimes it can affect your gauge and your spacing in your knitting. So if you can use like thin metal ones. This is a cute one that's a little heart. This one somebody made for me. It was a little paper star, and this has a little claw foot, so it can be used for knitting or crochet. Easy to take off. You can clip to your yarn. This one actually my daughter found for me at Kohl's, believe it or not. We were in the dressing room, and these were little, I think they're called bell pins, bell-shaped safety pins. She found them in the dressing room floor because they use them to connect some of the fabric. And she goes, "Mom, these would make great stitch markers." And sure enough, these are some of my favorite stitch markers ever. And you can put even a little charm on them if you wanted to. So, you know, not saying to go raid the women's dressing room, but if you ever need some, there's a good source to find them right there. So with that being said, that's really all the materials that you need are a tape measure, knitting needle, stitch markers, and some yarn. The next thing I want to talk about as far as materials is your yarn. And there's a few things that you want to learn about your yarn. They come, of course, in all different shapes and sizes. I pulled a couple of skeins. Yours was that you got from the library was already pre-wound, so you didn't get a yarn label. But I would like to kind of go over a couple of yarn labels, so when you do go shopping for yarn, you can find out what the information means. So first of all, we'll just start with Red Heart, because that's very common. You can find that in any box store. You can find it at Walmart. It's very versatile yarn. Things that you want to take a look for are the name of it, and then also the different sizing. Some yarns actually have patterns on them, which is nice, especially when you're starting out and you're trying to look for fun patterns. That's how I actually chose my yarn, was depending upon the pattern. I was like, oh, I want to make that. And the pattern's actually in the yarn label just underneath. So when you rip it out, just be mindful and rip it where the seam is so you don't actually rip into the pattern itself. It will tell you how much yardage you have. A lot of times it will also show the meterage, and then also ounces and grams. There's certain patterns that will say, oh, you need 3 grams of yarn, and you would use those as kind of a guiding line, especially if you don't use the same yarn for the pattern. Another thing that a yarn label will tell you is the weight. Yarn is weighted in, right now, 7 different sizes. It goes all the way from 0 to 6. 0 is super fine, like cobweb string all the way to 6, which is super bulky. And just because of all the big blankets that people are doing with the finger knitting, they've started to loosely create a 7 category, which is mega bulky. But I haven't really seen that in the yarns. But this will tell you if you ever hear of a medium or a worsted weight yarn. That's just kind of a symbol for it's kind of middle of the road as far as sizing. It's a good general multi-purpose yarn for any project you have. It will also tell you the sizing as to what yarn, what needle to use. For this one, for example, it will tell you for knitting, and you can see because you have 2 knitting needles, the hook is for crochet, but it will say with a US 8 needle, if you cast on 17 stitches and you knit for 23 rows, and usually the standard is in stockinette stitch, you should get a 4-inch by 4-inch square. They also have the millimeter conversion for the USA, and then, of course, centimeter size. Same thing for the crochet. You would use like an eye hook. You would chain 12 single crochets. You would crochet for 15 rows, and you should get a 4x4 square. So usually that is your gauge. That will tell you if you're spot on. If your project, if you cast on with 17 stitches and you knit and you realize your project is too large, that means you need to go up a needle size to shrink it down. If your project is too small, then you need to go up a needle size. In addition, they also have the care instructions. So it can tell you for this one that you can wash it, you can dry it, do not iron. It will tell you the contents, which is also, let's see, where's the information? It should tell you if it's acrylic. This will tell you. It will tell you the content. Oh, there it is, sorry. 100% acrylic. So acrylic is like a plastic. So that's why you don't want to iron it, because you will essentially melt your fibers together. And they call it killing because after you iron it and it goes flat, it won't return back into its shape. Another important thing to pay attention to for your content is the dye lot. If you use more than 1 yarn for your project, you want to make sure that the dye lot will be the same. For Red Heart, a lot of times they say no dye lot because they're pretty consistent with their coloring. But I still like to match up as much as the numbering as I can, just so that way you know it was manufactured at the same time to avoid any inconsistencies. For example, here's another yarn. And this one is from Hobby Lobby. I love this cotton. And it will tell you the same information. It will tell you that this is a 4 worsted yarn. It'll tell you your care labels. It will tell you your material. It will tell you the amount of yarn that's in your project. And it will tell you how much to cast on and knit with what needle. And then here is the dye lot number, and also what the name of the yarn is. So pay attention, most importantly, to the dye lot if you're going to use more than 1 color, because even if it's a different dye lot, it could be off just a tiny shade, and then you'll cry if you can notice that shade difference. Another common yarn is called Care and Simply Soft. That can be found at Joann's, Michael's. Same information. It provides the material content, the amount, the care and instructions, and the gauge. And then it will also tell you what the item is, and then the dye lot number. So that's basically the information that you can find with these materials. Oh, and there's some really cute wristlets. So tonight, now let's get to the project, because that's what we're here for, and that's what we want to learn. And we're going to make this fantastic, very great, simple, soft, squishy dishcloth. I always like teaching dishcloths because usually it doesn't matter what it looks like in the end. It'll still clean your dishes, or you can use it as a trivet, and it'll be the most beautiful thing that you'll ever have. So therefore, when you end with a project, it's not like, oh, I have a square, now what do I do with it? You actually have some form or function or use for it, no matter what. I have a couple of dishcloths that I actually use as washcloths in the shower, so I'm the only one who gets to know what it ultimately looks like. So these are great materials to have. So with knitting, there's 2 different stitches. Tonight, we're just going to learn one stitch. We're going to learn the knit stitch, and we're going to learn how to cast on. We're going to learn how to count our stitches. We're going to knit, and then a few stitches in, because we won't finish our project tonight, I'm going to show you how to bind off. So then that way, when you are ready to bind off on your own project at home, you'll know how to do that. Of course, there's also wonderful YouTube resources online, and in your packet, I've listed a few helpful knitting websites as well that can show you where to find online help if you need to. So tonight, let's go ahead and get started. So if you have your project, just to show you a lot of patterns, they will list what materials that you need. So we don't need any stitch markers tonight, but we'll need just our yarn that we're going to work with, our knitting needles that we're working with, and then of course our darning needle at the end for when we're going to knit. Size really doesn't matter too much, but if you wanted to match a gauge, you would knit 4 stitches to the inch. We're going to learn how to cast on. Our ST stands for stitches, K is knitting, BO is bind off. And luckily, this is just one row, so it's going to be a 1 row repeat. So it's a very simple pattern to do. So to get our yarn, I've wound it into what they call a cake. So it's also a center pull, so you can probably see a string in the center. If you ever do a yarn, Red Heart's kind of good with a little tutorial. But if you ever look at a yarn, you never know where to pull. This one actually was really easy. It was already out. But if you ever look for the outside of the ball yarn, and this one's pretty well hidden, sometimes it hides in there. If the outside of the ball yarn is facing one way, if it's facing this way when it's laying out, you're automatically going to pull from the opposite end. So that's a trick I've learned from helping to find the skein. But in the end, sometimes you come out with a big wad of yarn at the very end, and all you can do is just knit it quickly so you can get started. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is learn how to make a slip knot. We always start with 1 stitch on our needle, and to do so, we're just going to make a basic knot, and it's kind of a nice little magic trick knot because it will remove. I always like to wrap my yarn around my finger 2 times. Then I take the outer loop and I pass it over to make an X. And then I take the next, now this outer loop, and then I pass it over that string and then over my finger. So I have a loop. I grab both fingers or both strings with my finger and pull. And therefore I've made a slip knot. And it's nice because then I can always pull it out if I didn't like it. When you knit, you always want to have some string or what they call a tail, so that way you can use it to weave in your stitches later. So I like to leave about 6 inches, and then you can start your yarn tail again. So if you weave it or if you lay it over your finger, when you wrap it around twice, you're going to take your outer string away from your finger, pass it over like an X, then take the new outer and pass it over your finger, and then pull both strings. So that's how we're going to get started. And we're going to take one of our needles and just lay it on your left needle, and we're just going to tighten that slip knot. It's a great adjustable knot, so you can tighten it. You don't want to tighten it so much that you're choking your needle. You do want it loose because you will be knitting into it. So just kind of a nice loose tension. And there's several different ways to start and cast on. A common one is a long tail cast on, but I'm going to teach you what they call the knitted cast on. That way we're going to be knitting right from the get-go. This is a pretty sturdy one. It does look a little looser at the base, as you can see. Here, it's just, it looks a little floppier, but it's a great tutorial to get you to start knitting right from the get-go. So we're going to start with that. It's also great if you ever have to cast on stitches mid-point as well. There's certain patterns that may have you add on stitches. This would be a stitch that you would learn. So what you're going to do is keep your stitch on your needle. Also, if you notice, I did give you wooden needles or bamboo needles, and the reason why is because the wooden needles have a little bit of grip, a little bit of bite on your yarn, which is wonderful when you get started because you're not used to holding your yarn for tension yet. And then that way you don't have to worry so much about the stitches falling off. They do make metal needles, they make resin, they make plastic needles, which is what I'm using, and they get a little slipperier the way, you know, the different materials that you change. So especially as you learn, stick with wooden needles to begin with until you get comfortable with how you want to hold your yarn. So there's a wonderful little nursery rhyme I always love to tell. This is how the nursery rhyme goes to knit. You go in through the front door, go around back, out through the window, and off jumps Jack. There's also a little more of a gruesome one, which is appropriate for Halloween, but I'm going to stick with the nice, happy little nursery Mother Goose one for tonight. So to go in through the front door, we're going to look at our stitch, and we're going to treat this as the door. So we're going to go in left to right, and we're going to take, and then we're going to go in back. So we're going to take our needle, go through that stitch, and make an X. We're going to go through the back of it. Let me see if I can kind of zoom in a little bit too. Okay. So then we're going to take our yarn, not the tail. We're going to leave that alone. We're going to take our yarn. So we went in through the front door. Now we're going to go around back. We're going to take our yarn and we're going to wrap it around the back of our needle and lay it across. And so now we're going to take this yarn that we just laid over and we're going to bring it through our stitch. And a good way to make sure nothing falls off is if you just want to hold it with your finger. So I like to just kind of hold it there so it's not going anywhere. And if you work closer to your tip and make a T, sometimes that will help. You're just going to pull it through. Now, Jack will not be jumping off right now because we don't have any stitches. So what we're going to do is we're going to add more stitches. So we're going to pull this out a little bit to give us some slack. We're going to take our left needle, go underneath the yarn, put it on the needle, and you can hold it if you need to so it won't fall off. And then you're just going to pull your yarn. And then we'll have our slip knot and the new stitch we made. So the next stitch we're going to do is now we're going to ignore this last stitch because that's an old stitch now. Now we're going to work in the new stitch. So we're going to go in through the front door. We're going to go left on the left side of it and we're going to push it in the back. So as you can see, I'm just taking the stitch or taking the right needle and then just pushing it through. And if you need to, you can kind of hold your yarn or hold your needles with your hand as you grab your yarn. So we went in through the front door. We're going to go around back. So we're going to take our yarn, we're going to wrap it around and lay it across. And if you want, hold it with your finger so it's not going to go anywhere. Then we're going to go in through the front door. So we're going to take that loop and we're going to go back out the front door. And if you want to make a T, that will kind of help, you know, make sure it won't fall off. And then you're just going to pull out to give yourself some slack. And you're going to go underneath the stitch. And the reason why I'm having you go underneath rather than through is when you put the needle on this way, it will twist your stitch and that first row will feel tighter when you first knit. So if you go underneath the stitch and put it on, it's not, it'll feel much looser for the next round. and then you're just going to pull. And you don't want to pull too tight because remember you will be going into the stitch. So just loose enough where it's going to look even. Okay, so now we'll have 3 stitches and we're just going to keep doing that. So for our pattern, we're casting on 32 stitches. For my sample that I'm going to cast on, I'm going to cast on 12, so then that way I can show you. And if you want to cast on smaller stitches for practicing, that's fine too. So now we're going to go in through the front door, and I'm going to hold it just so I can grab onto my yarn. We're going to go around back and lay it across, and I like to hold it, that way it doesn't flop. And then we're going to go out through the window, so I'm just going to make a T, bring it over, and then you pull out a little bit so you have some slack, and then bring your needle under and put it on your stitch, and then just pull gently to leave it. So I have 4 stitches. Does anybody have any questions? Is it feeling okay? Do I need to go slower? So we're going to go in through the front door. Yes, go ahead. Okay. In through the front door, go around back, out through the window. And we're just going to go underneath right now and put it on the needle.
And just a little forgive me, this is redundant. I know it's happened to me. If you do have a question, remember to unmute yourself and then ask your question. Thanks.
So right now I have 5 stitches on the needle. So I'm going to do it again. I'm going to go in through that first stitch. Take my yarn, we're going to wrap it around from the back to the front. Hold my yarn, make a little T, bring it over and through. And you can pull as far, as wide as you want to. You know, just as long as it's comfortable for you to be able to get your stitch on there. And then you can just tighten it right back up. That's the nice thing about yarn, it's very fluid. And as you get a little more comfortable with the method, you can start to learn how you want to hold your yarn in the right hand side. And I can kind of show you a couple of different options. And there's no right way, it's just whatever's comfortable for you. I like to use kind of my whole hand. I will wrap it around my pinky, and then I'll go underneath my index finger. And then that way I can use my pinky as a stop for tension. And then I use my right hand as the guide. I know some people will just wrap it around their index finger a few times and just use that only. And then there's some people that, you know, just hold on, you know, they don't really hold on to it. They just kind of like pinch it with their fingers. Right now, I'm not too worried about how you hold your yarn. I'm wanting you to focus on getting the movements and the actual process of knitting the stitch. So again, we're going to go in through the front door. So we're going to go left to right and go right to the back to make an X. And then you can hold it and pinch it as you grab your yarn. Then you can wrap it around. And then you can, if you hold it in your hands, then you can kind of pull down with your yarn. That's another way to do it if you don't want to hold it with your index finger. If you pull down, that will give it a little bit of tension. So then that way it will go over into your stitch. So go ahead and feel free to speed along if you are feeling more comfortable. So I have 3, 6, 9. I'm going to make 3 more stitches, and then I'm going to show you what the next row is. And the next row will just be repeating from here on out. So I've gone in through the front door, go around back, out through the window, We're going to put this on. If you're casting on and you're realizing, oh, you know, I don't really like this stitch, it's very easy to take off. You can just kind of pull it off. You can slide your stitches up a little closer to your point. You can just pull it off, and then you can just pull your stitch. If you have a couple, you can just easily, you know, take them all off and then just pull your yarn. Like if I didn't like this one, I can pull that one off and just pull. And the previous stitches stay on your needle, so you don't have a risk of the other ones falling off. So if there is a stitch that you feel like isn't very even or it's a little wonky, feel free to take it off. But yarn is very fluid and very forgiving, so even if it doesn't look very good right now, it will, when you start your next rows, it will start to even out. Also, when you wash your yarn in what they call blocking, the stitches will start to smooth out and even across your rows. So don't feel too worried if one stitch looks a little wonky right now, because it will even out in the long run. And it's just yarn too, so that's the best part, that you don't have to be completely perfect. So we're going to go around, over and through, and then pick it up underneath and then just pull. So in through the front door, go around back, out through the window, and on jumps Jack right now. I'm just going to do a couple more stitches. Pull through and on. Go through this yarn in the back, wrap it around, go over, and then put the stitch on. So when you get the amount of stitches that you have on right now, and of course they're easy to count because they're all on your needle, so whatever stitch that you have or whatever loop you have are the amount of stitches that you have on. You're going to actually start your knitting. Like I mentioned at the beginning, the concept of knitting is to take all your stitches on one needle and we're going to transfer them to the next needle. So essentially, we're going to just rotate them, switch them from one end to the other, and by adding a loop and adding a row every time, it will make our project get longer and longer. We know at the bottom, this is our bottom, so you always want to make sure that this is facing down. It's not up or twisted. You don't want to twist your project, so you want to make sure all the stitches are facing down in the same way. When you get started, luckily you already know 3/4 of the knit stitch right now because you've been doing it. You're going to go in through the front door. We're going to go around back. We're going to go out through the window. And now here's our off jumps Jack. So now we have our new stitch, our new loop on our right needle, but now we need to get him off the left needle. So we're just going to slide our stitches and just kind of push them off. So we don't need to add any more to our left needle when you're ready. And now we have our new row on our right needle. So again, we're going to do that again. And if it kind of gaps a little bit, that's fine. You can always kind of tug it a little bit with your yarn just to bring it back into shape. So we're going to now work on our next stitch. So we're going to go in through the front door, go around back, out through the window, and off jumps Jack. So we're going to take off our stitch on our left, just kick him off, and now we have 2 stitches on our right. And we're going to do that all the way to the end of our row until there's no more. Now these first couple of rows are a little fidgety just because there's kind of no meat. There's nothing really to hold on to. And right now all you're feeling is needle. So you can go a little slower. Also, it might be a little tighter because your cast on is always just a little slightly different. So just take that into account. I like to work closer to my tips so that way I don't spread out my stitches too far, but do what is more comfortable for you. If you feel like you want to go down here when you're knitting, that's fine. But just remember, you're going to have to slide your stitches up because you see how it's hard to bring them over. So just scoot all your stitches up gently so you can complete your stitch. And then you can just slide it and then kick the next stitch off. So again, in through the front door on our left needle. We're going to go around back. You can hold that stitch so it won't go anywhere. Off through the needle. I'm going to hold them right here. Out through the window. And then off jumps Jack. So I'm just going to kick him off. So around, through, and off. In, around, through, and off. In, around, through, and off. When you get closer to the end of your stitches on your row, they can start to feel a little bit fidgety. So when that happens, just be aware of that, and you may have to use your index finger just to hold your other stitches so they don't accidentally slip off. If you do have a situation where it's like, whoops, my stitches slipped off, number one, don't panic. A lot of times, as you can see, they stay pretty well in shape. They retain their form unless you accidentally like pull your knitting needles really far apart really quickly. So if that happens where your stitches falls off, all you have to do is just gently slide them back on, and voila, all good. So again, in, around, through, and off. In, around, through, and off. And I have my last stitch. We're going to go in, around, through, and off. So now I have all my stitches on the right hand needle. I have a little more fabric to play with, and I have an empty left hand needle. So now how do you start your next row? Well, the easiest way is to switch them. So now your right needle becomes your left needle, and your left needle becomes your right. And as you can see from this side, this is what you would be your back side because you were knitting. You have all these bumps on the stitch. But because we're doing the same stitch on both sides, we're going to have bumps both on this side and also on this one. So right now, we've just created a flat fabric on one side and kind of a bumpy on the other, but we're going to change that with this next row. So again, we just start to do the exact same thing. We're going to go in through the first stitch, take our yarn, go around back, through, and off. Through and off. In, around, through, and off. So hopefully by casting on with the knitted stitch and now doing a couple of rows, it should be getting a little more comfortable. Hopefully not too boring yet. If not, it'll make for a very long project. Just think of all those fun dishes you're going to be washing when you're finished. And you don't have to make them square. You can make them rectangular. I've made them where I use them as my Swiffer covers. So I was tired of buying the reusable ones. So I made a lovely little rectangle one, and then I would fold them over, and I sewed it to my Swiffer, and it was wonderful. And then all you gotta do is throw it in the wash. So if you make a couple of those, instant recyclable project there. So now I'm at the end, so I'm gonna rotate it. So now my right needle is gonna become my left. And as you can see now, I have bumps on this side, and also bumps on that side. And then as you get a little more comfortable, you'll figure out your way to do it. Like I said, I like to wrap mine around my pinky. I'll lay it over my fingers and then go around. That way I can use that as a stopper. I can let the yarn out and then I can stop it so it won't go further. And as you can see, I work close to the needle tips, to the points. I feel like I get better control. But remember that your needle, even though you do work close to the points, make sure that when you do actually make your stitch, you go on the fattest part of your needle, because this is actually the diameter of your stitch. If you make all your stitches right here, when you start to push them down, it's going to be a lot tighter, and they'll be tighter the next time you go. Because as you can see, mine are pretty loose. They're able to slide. But if you only stop right here, it's going to make for a very tight stitch, and then it won't be the size that you intended for your project. One thing, hopefully you'll be able to, before you take a break, that you'll be able to actually complete one row. I know my husband's tired of saying, one more row, or let me finish my row before I get up and do something, because a lot of times it can be very confusing. He's actually told me that he's going to bury me in the very last plot on the rows. That way I can say I completed the row, because that'll be one that, you know, I never get to go anywhere until I'm finished. But if, let's say for some reason the phone rings, the kids go crazy, the dog knocks something out, you have to put your yarn down, and then you're picking it up and you're like, oh no, you know, where was I? Which way do I go? What do I do? The easy way to see is where your yarn is tied to. So the yarn is tied to the very last stitch that you made. So if you pull it, you can kind of see this yarn. This stitch is the one that's moving. So I know that this is the last stitch I made, which means this is the stitch that I get to do next. So if it looks like this, and another way to tell is if my yarn is on the left side, then I know my fabric is backwards, because I'm not going to be picking up my yarn with my left hand. I'm going to be picking it up with my right. So just flip your project over, and then you can just keep going. If you accidentally put it down and you stop and you knitted, you continue to knit the same stitch, you would create what they call a short row. So it's making a mini row within that same project. So then you'll start increasing. A lot of times in sewing, it would be helpful if you were making a bust in a garment where you needed a little extra fabric. That's how you would make short rows, is you would give it a little more fabric in a spot. Socks are common to use short rows, especially when making the heel. So I'm going to turn it over this way, and then I'm just going to continue knitting. When you do put your project down and you're ready to take a break, I always suggest, if you have a circular needle, it's really nice because I can just slide it right to the middle of my project and set it down, and it's not going to go anywhere. And sometimes I'll even tie my needles together. I can do it with this particular kind, but that way it's not going to go anywhere. With straight needles, just slide them all the way to the bottom where you have your bead. That provides a little extra protection. You can also take your knitting needles together if you want, and you can put a rubber band around them, or even just the one that has the fabric on it. So that's a good stopper. You can use erasers if you wanted to as kind of the point covers. They do make, you can also use kind of like coil bracelets or bands. You can just use the coils to go around them as well. So just anything to kind of help hold your project in place while you're not knitting is always handy to do. It's never fun to pull out your knitting and then all your hard work has come undone. Also at the beginning too, it's good to count your stitches after every row. That's to make sure that you haven't gained a stitch. Every time you gain a stitch, you're increasing. And the most common way to increase a stitch or increase a row is at the beginning. And I will show you that you want to make sure that when you start your yarn and you start your row, that your yarn is down into the back. So when you go in, remember we're only going into that stitch. If you accidentally take your yarn and you bring it over, see how now I've created 2 stitches? And a lot of times then you would knit into 2 and now you've just increased a stitch. So you always want to make sure your yarn is down into the back and you want to have a bump right there. And that first one is always going to be floppy. And that's because it's not connected to another stitch. So it doesn't really have anything to hold on to it like the rest of them, how they're a little nicer. But as you can see, every row, it does get a little cleaner. So just remember when your yarn, when you get ready to start, it's down into the back and you're only going into the top of the stitch above that bump. So if you do not see a bump, there's no bump right there, then that should be a trigger to let you know that you may want to take a look at your yarn to make sure it's in the right way. So we want it down into the back. I'm going to go around. The yarn I'm using and in the pattern I selected was Hobby Lobby's I Love This Cotton. Of course, obviously you can only find it at Hobby Lobby. I chose it because it is a softer cotton. So a lot of times you'll find certain cottons, just because of the cotton, the nature of it, it's a little rougher, it's a little more coarse, and it can dry out your hands because cotton is absorbent. So if you're making a lot of things with cotton and you feel that your hands are getting dry, to always, you may have to lotion up a little bit. But this, I Love This Cotton is just, it's really soft and it comes in a lot of great colors, and I haven't found it to bleed, where if you mix it in with a red and you use like a white, for example, if you want to do a candy cane stitch cloth during Christmas, the colors don't bleed together. So there's some fun color varieties. I also suggest for the first few projects to work with lighter colors, because that way you can see your stitches. If you work in the dark purples or the navies or black yarns, it is a little harder to see. Luckily, if you're just knitting across, you can just, as long as you can see your stitches on there, it won't matter as much. But if you get into more complicated stitches, especially learning a new stitch, you want to be able to see what you're doing. So just remember to go over the bump when you go into your stitch. Another common mistake is to go into the bump just below the stitch. And if you do that, you're knitting 2 stitches, and then it's going to change and bring up your fabric a little bit. So that is another mistake that sometimes we can get, is instead of going into the stitch that's directly on the needle, we'll accidentally go into that bump. That is a design feature where you can pick up, it's called brioche, is one way, if you ever hear that term. But it will kind of pucker up your fabric and bring it up. And you'll notice a difference in the change of the texture. I'm just going to go ahead and leave those on there for right now. But if this is your first project and you've made a little mistake, don't worry about it. Just keep on going and just enjoy the process. We'll be like Bob Ross and think of happy little trees. Another thing that is common is, as we're knitting, if you put it down, and if you don't know if you've knitted the stitch, like if you're already in the needle and you don't know what you've done, number one, you can pull your stitch out and start fresh in that stitch, but make sure you can see where your yarn is. So if you have a yarn that's crossed over, all you have to do is pull through. Sometimes if somebody looks at it, they're like, oh, I don't know what I've done. So they're going to wrap it around again and pull through. And if they do, as you can see, I've created a longer stitch, and I've also created 2 stitches. So then the next time you go back, you may knit them individually. That's also another way to increase a stitch accidentally. When that happens, if you ever need to pull back, again, pull your yarn and you can follow the path of your yarn. And as you can see, my yarn goes through this bump right here. If you stick your needle in that bump, then you can kick off these stitches on that needle, and then you just pull that. That is called tinking, T-I-N-K. It's knit spelled backwards. So if you ever need to take off a stitch or 2, you can tink it. If you have to rip out a whole project or several rows, they call it frogging, because you're ripping it, you're ripping it, you're ripping it. So there's a little knitting jargon for you. So again, if I wanted to take off this stitch, I did something wrong or I didn't like it, just follow your yarn. And as you can see, my yarn goes just to that loop here where it follows. I'm just going to stick my needle under that, and then I can just kick that stitch off and pull that yarn, and then I'm back to where I want to be. So for this project, we're just going to continue to knit until you get the length you want. If you don't have a tape measure handy at the time when you get close, what I like to do if you want a square is I always liked origami. I would fold my fabric, so I would just take one corner and fold it up. And if it would cover my whole point, then I know I'm square. If not, obviously, I need to go much further because I have all this as a gap. You do this project, should be able to meet to the point. And then, you got a pretty square project when you get to that point. So that's kind of a quick way to see how close you are to your sizing. So again, just make sure your yarn is down and to the back, and we're going to go above that bump when you finish the row. How's everyone doing? Can you show me your projects? Excellent. Look at that progress. I'm impressed, Laura. Yeah, and it'll take a little bit of practice. In worst case, if you get frustrated, rip it out and start again. My husband, he's in theater, and as the technical director, one year he bought a serger for the costume department, and it came with free lessons. So he's like, sure, why not? I'm going to learn how to work a serger. And the first thing the lady did was they said, we're going to learn how to thread your serger. And I personally have never threaded a serger, but I understand it's very complicated. And of course, there's several bobbins you have to take care of. But then after everybody learned how to thread it, she came behind everyone with scissors and just snipped all the string. And they said, all right, do it again. And she did that 2 or 3 times. And there were people that were getting frustrated with it. And they say, if you don't know how to thread your own machine, it's just going to be a paperweight for you. So, of course, obviously with Zoom, I can't be as nice. But in person, when I teach somebody how to knit, I'll teach them to cast on. Then I'll pull off all their row, and I'll make them do it again. Of course, they're completely shocked and panicked. But if you don't know how to cast on and start your own project, then it's going to be hard for you to continue. So I strongly suggest if it's feeling a little frustrating, or you're not getting it right, just go ahead and rip it off. Do it now while you're still a couple of rows in. You'll feel better in the long run, and you won't fret so much, and you'll get your practice on casting on again. And since Anali is recording this, I'm sure she'll make it available for you all so you can watch it again if you need to, and be happy to show you. So the next thing, it's about 7:10, so I want to make sure we have enough time for any Q&A, and I want to show you a couple of other fun things. But for the most part, it's just going to be the same stitch over and over again. But now you get to the end, and now you have to actually get your stitches off the needle. So the next thing you're going to want to do is bind off your stitches. So I'm just going to stop here for my project. I'm going to pretend I'm finished, and I'm going to teach you all how to bind off. If you're not ready to do that yet, that's perfectly fine. But you will have an idea. Essentially, it's still very much the knit stitch. It's just one little tweak to it. So what we're going to do is knit the first 2 stitches. And binding off just means that you're locking your stitches in, so then that way they won't drop. Right now, if you happen to drop a stitch, it will do a ladder and it will go all the way to the end, and then you'll have this nice, lovely little gap. And sometimes it's intentional, but a lot of times it's not. But that could be another fun class, is learning how to fix the mistakes and how to pick up your stitches. But right now I'm finished with my project, so I'm going to knit the first 2 stitches. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pass over. So I'm going to take the first stitch I knit, the one furthest away from the point, and I'm going to just grab it with my needle. I'm going to hold that first stitch, and I'm just going to pass it over. So now I have 1 stitch on my needle and the other one is locked. I'm going to do it again. I'm going to knit 1 more stitch. Same process, just go around, through, and off. But now instead of knitting the 3rd stitch, I'm going to take the old stitch. I'll just hold that so it doesn't fall off. And I'm just going to pass it over. When you do bind off, this is a time, loose is best. If you do it too tight, it'll bunch up and scrunch up at the top, and it'll feel tighter and shorter up at the top, where the bottom will feel more loose. So you want to do it somewhat loosely, and you can kind of pull it a little bit. You can see my stitches are a lot looser than they have been for the knitting portion. And then you're just going to take that stitch and pass it over. So again, I'm going to knit and take the old stitch, pass it over. Wrap it around, take the old stitch, pass it over. So you can start to see it's creating this really pretty little chain up at the top. And it's locking the stitches in. Obviously, they're not passing over. It's like this little daisy chain. Passing it over. Take this stitch, pass it over. So I have 4 stitches to go. Technically 5, because there's 1 on the right needle. When you do bind off, I would strongly suggest you do it all in one sitting, so that way you don't run the risk of it accidentally undoing everything you did. So have dedicated time, maybe mute the TV during this portion. But luckily you only have 32 stitches or so to do this, so it shouldn't take you too long. Then I have 1 stitch on each needle. I'm going to wrap and pass it off. So now I have one stitch left on my needle. Obviously, if I just pulled this off my needle right now, everything would then unravel because this one needs to be locked in. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take my handy dandy scissors, cut leaving about a 6-inch tail because you're going to be weaving in those stitches as well. You want to give you enough leeway. And then this one's just the real fun part. You take that stitch and you go whoop, and you just pull it right off. So now it's officially locked on. It's not going anywhere. And you have kind of your knitting bumps on the side. And then you can kind of see my 2 stitches that I got a little wonky with right here when I went into that stitch below. So as you can see what that looks like, but you know, it's not really that big of a deal. It'll still scrub. On the other side, it's not that obvious. But that would be the only thing that you could see, is because you went into that stitch below that bump, then you don't have that bump there, so that erased it. Then you would take your darning needle. This is a good time also to decide which is your right side and which is your left side. Usually when you are knitting, you have essentially a reversible fabric. So there really is no right or wrong side. I know when I cast on and started knitting when my yarn tail was on the right. So I'll deem this as my right side, kind of the cleaner side or the better side. So when you weave in your stitches, you'll weave them to the back. And I'll show you a fun trick that I learned, how to, thread your needle. Of course, a lot of times if you have the blunt tips, they have a wider eye. But instead of licking it, or even with your sewing needles, this has been a fun tip that I've learned, that if you lay your yarn over your needle when it's up and down, not flat, and you pinch it really tight, you pull it tight and slide it off, then it'll fit inside your needle. And that would work for any size needle. And it's been a handy tip that I like and I use a lot. And when you weave in your stitches, you can follow your grain a bit. So as you can see, you make these fun little figure 8 loops. Or you can just stab it and stick it wherever you want to. But a lot of times I'll start at an edge just so that way you can kind of clean up a little bit. But then if you want, you can follow kind of the path. So as you can see, my yarn goes here, and by it naturally wants to go underneath it. I'm just going to go naturally underneath. Stitch. And of course, this doesn't have a bump up here, but you can just go into the next bump over. And then you can follow this one. I do a true follow the serpentine pattern, because if you see, if I spread my yarn, you can see this, where this yarn goes. So this next stitch, for example, it goes underneath here, then it goes through this stitch and this stitch. Here. And then it comes back around here, goes under that bump. And it follows here. So as you can see, it has this kind of the serpentine feel. But if you don't want to go that far, you can just go a couple stitches this way. And then if you go back the same way you came, you can also go a row down if you want. I'll sometimes go just back the same way I came. and that will lock in your stitch. So that's why it's nice to have about 6 inches worth, because that will give you plenty of space to go back and forth a couple of times to make sure that that stitch is locked in. And especially if you're going to use it for washing and that agitation, you don't want those stitches to come out and all that hard work. And I'll just go right here. And then when you're done, actually I'm not going to end right there on the edge because you don't want your tail end to pick up. So I'll just go one more stitch right here. You can kind of give it a nice little tug just to make sure all those stitches are set up and lined up nicely, and they're not going to come anywhere. It's going to settle in, and then you can just clip your. I'm a lefty using right-handed scissors here. I say I'm a lefty, but I actually knit right-handed, so there you go. I need to get sharper scissors. And then you would just do the same thing to the bottom. You would just weave it in on that same side. And you can see it's not that big of a deal to see, and then it doesn't show up on your nice right side. So that is essentially how you cast on, how you start knitting, and then how you bind off right there. So of course the bottoms look a little different because the cast on's a little different. There is a cast on method called the long tail cast on, and it will look a little similar to this braided daisy look. So you can try different styles to cast on. And I believe the library has a book. It may be at the Savannah branch, but they do have it, and it's called 52 stitches, 52 cast on and cast off stitches, I believe. But there's some great resources, great books here at the library, here at Rolling Hills on the Belt branch, but then also at the Savannah branch. And of course, if you find a book, they'll be happy to bring it here to the St. Joe location. I think the Savannah has a few more knitting and crochets, but I believe one of the librarians over there, she's a big knitter and a spinner and a weaver. So I'm sure she wants to make sure those are close to her heart, but they're nice, and they'll share to the Belt branch too. So don't hesitate to look at their collection. There's also a couple of books, pattern books on Overdrive as well. And then with the library, they have RB Digital, and they have Interweave Knitting as one of their magazines. So it's fun to take a look and be inspired. So anyway, here's my little sample swatch project. I hope yours is just as fun as mine, and of course you'll get to learn all kinds of new tricks and tips when you're practicing as well. For that, I wanted to show you a couple of the resources. So with your project, you also got this knitting resource page. It's 2 pages worth. But this one, it tells you a little bit about the yarn weight and gauge. So on the ball band, I showed you the different sizes. And so the one we worked with was the medium or the worsted weight. This will kind of tell you the different names. So if you ever see like, oh, that this calls for a DK weight yarn, you'd be looking at a light 3. And then this tells you about how many stitches per inch that you would get with your project. And for example, when you're measuring, I'll use this project because it's bigger. The larger the swatch, the better, because you never want to measure the ends. But if you measure kind of in the center, and you can take whichever bump you would like. So I'm going to just follow the bottom bumps just because it's close to the marker, and you want to make sure it's lined up. And so as you can see, I have 1, 2, 3, 4 stitches. So mine has 4 stitches to the inch, but it's always good to take a larger sampling. So I'm going to go up to 4 inches. So I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. So I was very consistent all the way through. So I am 4 stitches to the inch with this particular pattern. Also, when you measure, you don't want to make sure that you're stretched out. You want to make sure your project is nice and relaxed. Flop it around a little bit, let it get used to it, and then you can measure. And then try to measure in the centermost part. You can also measure a couple of times at the top, the center, at the bottom, just to make sure you're consistent. But that will tell you about how many stitches that you need, and usually it has your recommended needle size. And for here, they kind of give you a range because everyone knits a little differently and a little tighter, a little looser. So this will tell you how many stitches. This one has the recommended hook size, the wraps per inch. That's when they're actually taking the yarn and wrapping it around their needle. And so when you do wraps per inch, that's how they would decide that. And then usually the yards per your project, this will usually tell you about how many yards is in an average ball. So in an average worsted weight yarn, you're looking somewhere between 218 to 262 yards on average in a blanket. And then it also gives you a great use of like what you would usually use for these common sizes. Like I said, the worsted weight is very versatile. You can do sweaters, blankets, hats, and as you get bigger, of course, the chunkier the projects, but they also work up a lot faster as well. Socks like to be in the lace weight or the fingering size. That's where you're going to find your socks. And then on the back of the resource, I also included terminology for you. So when you start reading a pattern, of course, just to save on space, especially in magazines, they start using abbreviations. So this will tell you what the abbreviations are and what they mean, and that will give you an idea. And then I also included some online resources and tools for you. Knitting Help is one of my favorites, and that was some of the projects, that was the first site that I was really using. Especially like learning how to cast on. They have, she has a video dedicated just for like the knitted cast on method or the long tail method or a German twisted method. So you have different sources that will only show you that one particular technique for casting on, for purling, for increases, decreases. So this is a really good tutorial to learn. YouTube is also wonderful. Ravelry, I wouldn't suggest going on there right away. It's a fantastic use for knitters and crocheters. It's a compendium of where you can use it as a community resource board. You can find any pattern knitted or crocheted, if it's in a magazine or if it's in a book or if it's an online digital resource. But it is quite the web of knitting and crochet. You can get sucked in really fast. So, you know, if you're ready to, when you are ready to get on there, I would suggest you give yourself plenty of time to allow for that looking around. And then you can find patterns definitely online and hard copy for magazines with patterns, books here at the library. And yarn companies have lots of free resource patterns because, of course, they want you to buy their yarn. Like I mentioned on the yarn label, they have patterns. You can also go to these are these big common ones, Lion Brand, Yarnspirations, and these are the brands that house these. And they have tons of free patterns, and you can sort by category, you can sort by yarn size. These are great tools to find free patterns. And then Overdrive and the library has wonderful resources. So feel free to list that, to look for those. I did list, of course, Rolling Hills Library. I always go to them, always check out the new section. That's the category for knitting is 746 for the Dewey Decimal System. So I have that memorized very well, and I go to that all the time. And then also Craft and Chat. This is the group that I'm a part of that's here in St. Joe. We meet every night. At the mall, but right now, of course, we're not meeting in person. We're doing it via Zoom. But if you want to meet with other crafters, you certainly can through Craft and Chat. We also meet here at the library for once a month on Saturday. So when we're able to do that again, we're usually here and we bring food and have a good old time. So we'd love to see you at any of the meetings. If you'd like to just knit and crochet and just gather with other social people. And I'm on there a lot, so you'll see me. And of course, if you have any questions, I'm always happy to answer. And Ollie, I just want to show one more thing. If you could spotlight me, please. I want to share a PowerPoint slide of you've made a square, now what? A lot of times, once you've made a square, it's kind of like, okay, great. Now I'm ready to do something else with it other than just the dishcloth. So I'd like to share my screen with you real quick, and made a cute little PowerPoint that will showcase some of the fun things that we can learn. Let's see. Oops. There it is. Okay. So what else can be done with a square? Once you finish your swatch, be proud of it. Go ahead and start displaying it. This would be a fun way if you have a Cricut and other tools to just, cut out a little design or cut something out of wood and frame it, mount it to a little shadow box and show off all your handiwork. Might as well. Blankets are great. You can do it in several different ways. You can make small squares like this granny square on the left-hand side and assemble lots of pieces together. You can, up at the top, this one is a type of granny square where you start in the middle and you just keep going and going and going until you run out of yarn. Also at the bottom are just stripes. So this is exactly what we've been working on tonight, is a garter stitch, and all they did was change colors. And you can see just changing colors will it's a simple process, but you really focus on the color. Another knit blanket on the right, it's called a log cabin. Any quilters would be familiar with this. You start with a square and then you start picking up along the sides and you just go in a spiral until it's as big as you'd like. You can also make bags with your projects as well. So take a simple square. In the bottom right hand, the little bags, it's just a basic rectangle, and you just do a quick little cast on and cast off to make the handles, and then sew up the seams. In the upper corner, of course, you can just fold it into kind of little origami styles and then sew up 3 of the seams. You can make little boxes and you can make bags. The bag on the left was when my daughter was big into Dora the Explorer. We had a birthday party and I made 15 of those bags, and I'm tired of them, but they're garter stitched, exactly what we learned. It's just a big tube. You sew up the side, you make a square at the bottom, and then you make a little flap at the top, and voila, you have an instant bag. You can also do scarves and cows, same concept of just knitting, you just knit a little longer. You can do infinity scarves with just a little half twist and join it together, or regular swatch by just joining it on the side. You can do little samplers by, as you're learning new techniques, just keep on going and learn a new stitch and add on to it. You can also just make, like the blanket, you can make small little patches and go ahead and join together too. The big thing right now for accessories are the COVID mask extenders. So you can just make a little rectangle and sew a couple of buttons on the side, and you have a little bit of a protection there for your head. You can make wristlets by just doing a simple rectangle and sewing up the sides for that. You can make earrings, belts, necklaces. Hands and feet. The picture in the middle is actually, it's crocheted, but it's made flat where you just fold it. You make a big rectangle, you fold it in half and seam up the sides like you would a bag. And then of course they added little pom-poms. But you can do shoes and headbands. Ponchos are great and a fun little sporty clothes. A lot of times they're just 2 rectangles, and how you sew them together is how you can display. The one on the right are 2 rectangles, and then the poncho is you just sew up on the shorter side to make that. Use them as bunting, use them as jewelry holders. You can make your swatch, mount it to a picture frame, and then just hang jewelry from it. You can use it for placemats. You can do ornaments with it, make phone caddies for it. And then just for fun, can start to yarn bomb and just start putting pieces everywhere. The bookmarks I made for Halloween one year, and I gave those out, and all the kids loved them. They're like, "Oh, I got bookmarks." So that was my highlight one year. My hands were tired too. But you can make, clothing for pets and games and all kinds of fun things. So I hope that also gives you a few ideas of what you can do with your square once you're done, especially if you're tired of doing dishcloths, that you can do something else with it, and that you enjoyed making your project. And I hope that this will be a craft that you'll continue learning and you'll continue doing. And I'm happy to share my knowledge anytime. If you are interested in continuing and wanting to learn the next stitch, which is the purl stitch, luckily it's the last stitch, our next project for the Knitting 201 class is going to be a lovely little basket weave dishcloth, but we're going to learn how to purl in the same row to make these fun little squares, and it's a completely reversible fabric. And the nice thing is I made it where it's the exact same size as our knitted one, so then that way if you ever wanted to seam them together to make a blanket or a larger project, they should both equal about the same size, and you can seam them together. So that's all I have. If anyone has any questions.